Today, we are diving deep into the economy of Pakistan. And believe me, it's a fascinating story. It's a story of incredible potential, a wild roller coaster history, and some really tough challenges that affect the lives of millions and millions of people.
So to really get a handle on Pakistan, you first have to wrap your head around the sheer scale of its people. We're talking about a population of over 256 million. Now that's not just some number on a slide. That's a massive domestic market and an absolutely enormous labor force. It's the engine behind everything else we're going to talk about.
So with that many people, where does Pakistan's economy actually rank in the world? Well, if you're looking at nominal GDP, it's the 41st largest. It's a major player for sure. But the real story, the one that's full of twists and turns, that lies just underneath this simple number.
The official label for Pakistan's economy tells you so much. It's called a developing upper-middle income economy. And that dual identity is really the key. It perfectly captures this idea of a country that's on the move, right? It's got a growing industrial sector, but at the same time, it's wrestling with some really deep-rooted structural challenges.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we'll get a quick snapshot of the economy. Then, we're going to jump in a time machine and look at its wild history. After that, we'll break down the three main engines that actually power the whole thing, look at its connections to the world, both good and bad, and finally, we'll face the major challenges that are on the horizon.
To really get what's happening in Pakistan today, you have to look back. And this is not some simple straight line of growth. Oh no, it is a total roller coaster, a journey through decades of these huge, dramatic, and often completely contradictory policy changes.
I mean, just look at this economic whiplash. In the 50s, it's all about building industry from the ground up. Then the 60s hit, and it's a boom time, the decade of development, thanks to foreign aid and agricultural breakthroughs. But then, whoops, a hard turn in the 70s towards nationalizing everything. The 80s, a complete reversal back to privatization. The 90s were tough, with a huge debt crisis, leading into a new millennium that's been a real mixed bag.
So what's the big takeaway from all that? The only thing that's been consistent is constant change. These huge radical shifts in strategy, decade after decade, have made it incredibly difficult to build a stable foundation for the long term.
All right, so with that history in mind, what does the modern economy actually look like? Let's break down the core sectors, what I'm calling the three engines, that are actually powering this nation of 256 million people today.
So right off the bat, you can see the services sector is the undisputed heavyweight champion here. It makes up almost 60% of the entire economy. But, and this is a big but, that does not tell the whole story. The other two sectors, agriculture and industry, play roles that are absolutely critical for employment and stability.
Let's start with agriculture. It might be just under a quarter of the GDP, but look at its real impact on people. It employs over 37% of the entire workforce. For millions, this is it. It's the foundation of rural life, the main source of income. And the output here is just massive. We're talking almost 32 million tons of wheat, nearly 10 million tons of rice, and a staggering 10.2 million bales of cotton. That cotton, by the way, is the lifeblood of Pakistan's world-famous textile industry.
The second engine is industry, Pakistan's manufacturing powerhouse. It kicks in about 18% of the economy, and it's a huge job creator, especially in the country's fast-growing cities. Think about it. Nearly 40 million tons of cement are being produced to fuel construction. Over 1.2 million motorcycles are hitting the roads every single year, and almost 2.5 million metric tons of cotton yarn are feeding right back into those textile factories we just talked about.
And that brings us to the biggest engine of them all, the services sector. This really is the modern face of Pakistan's economy. It's being driven by super dynamic fields like telecom, banking, and all kinds of trade.
If you want a perfect example of this sector's explosive power, just look at the telecom boom. After the industry was opened up in the early 2000s, it just exploded. Mobile subscribers went from a mere 2.4 million in 2003 to over 195 million today. That is absolutely incredible growth, and it shows you the kind of potential we're talking about.
Okay, so we've seen the internal engines, but no economy is an island, right? So now let's look at how Pakistan plugs into the rest of the world. And it's a story of both crucial partnerships and some serious financial pressure.
One of the biggest economic headaches is this right here, the trade balance. Pakistan exports about $41 billion worth of stuff,
but it imports almost double that, nearly 78 billion. This gap, this trade deficit, puts constant, serious pressure on the country's currency and its savings of foreign money.
So who's on the other side of these trades? Well, the United States is the #1 buyer of Pakistani goods, especially textiles. But when it comes to buying things, China is by far the biggest source, followed by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, mostly for the fuel and energy needed to keep those economic engines running.
Now, this number. This represents another huge point of pressure from the outside world. $131 billion. That is the country's total external debt. Just paying the interest on this debt eats up a massive chunk of the national budget, and it hangs over every single economic decision the government has to make.
And that brings us to our final section. We're going to tie all of these different threads together now and look at the major hurdles Pakistan has to clear to build a more secure economic future.
The thing is, none of these challenges exist in a vacuum. They're all tangled together. That heavy debt we just saw, it gets way worse when you have political instability. Rapid population growth puts a huge strain on jobs and services. And then you have these deep systemic issues like inequality and a tax system that just doesn't bring in enough money. It's a complex web.
And look, these are not just abstract economic problems. This quote from the World Bank, it's a stark reminder of the real human cost. These pressures threaten the well-being of millions of people, which makes the stakes here incredibly, incredibly high.
Which leads us to the final critical question. You have this vast human potential, that massive population of 256 million we started with, and you've got rich natural resources. So the big question is, how will Pakistan navigate this economic crossroads? The path it takes now will really define its future for decades. Thanks so much for joining us.